So in this presentation, one of the things that I'm aware of is that um, many of the agencies, as Lisa said, are waiting for guidance on where we're going with M12, M19, 21. And this is what we've been doing over the last 8 years to kind of demonstrate areas. And then I'll present three different areas. Thank you. Three different areas for consideration by the agencies, as well as some recommendations in there. And too often I watched these presentations and I thought, well, I'll be obvious and say this is what we did, and I'll talk about some of the aspects. In 1921, it is focused on the delivery of permanent electronic records to NARA. And what we did was we updated our schedules. It's also focused on temporary records, either in paper format or getting them converted to electronic or managing the electronic born digital records. And so what we did was we started about 5 years ago a document management system with a module attached to it on the back end to do records management activities, and I'll talk about that. And then the last area that M1921 talks about is the appropriate MetaTags. And that's causing some consternation because in the paper world, when we were submitting forms and box manifests, it was fairly loosey-goosey for many years on how we would describe the contents of each transfer. This meta tagging is actually getting down to the granular level of the records themselves, and it may describe the entire transfer, but also it has to be able to attach or have some kind of reference capabilities to the actual documents or the records for retrieval. And also, if they're permanent electronic records, to assist NARA in curating this collection as public documents as it accessions them into their collection. Next slide, please. So what we did to update the record schedule was I drew out a chart because this is so hard to track, but at the same time, GSA was doing a comprehensive review and revision of all of its record schedules. GRS was doing the same. And so you can see that GRS reduced its total number of records by 32%. We were a little more drastic. Until 1985, NARS, or National Archives Record Service, was part of GSA, and they split away. And so we were kind of the test dummy, the Fermi lab of records, and when they were in paper form. And we ended up with quite a few schedules, quite a few record items. As you can see, GSA's temporary total number in 2015 was nearly 1,500 record items. We reduced that quite a bit by using big bucket scheduling, simplifying the record descriptions, and making them media neutral so we could start to anticipate M1921, or at the time it was M1812, and M1218. And basically, we focused on making these as media neutral as possible to handle electronic records, both in the permanent and temporary. So there's a huge reduction. So we reviewed our schedule to anticipate. The other thing I wanted to point out is we really reduced the number of permanent records from 67 to 28. That number makes it a lot easier to manage permanent electronic records when you have fewer record titles to deal with. Next slide, please. So document management, we set up a document management program as far back as 2007, but more recently we're operating under a current contract with a document management system that included a module for records management at the back end. As we've gotten more experienced over the last 5 years, we're taking in content in 3 different ways. First off, the obvious is the paper, 4 different ways. The paper scanning of documents. We scan, we put a companion spreadsheet, I call them meta maps, with the documents, and then merge them into the content management system. The second one is the Purple database, and that's like shared drives and Google Drives. And we basically drive those by each one of those migrations being a project, where we work with the lines of business to identify what meta tags they want to associate with the records or the documents being brought across, and then we put it into the content management system. The third is the application layer, and this is where we have turnkey systems that were built specific for GSA and their different business lines, be it public buildings, transportation, scheduling, um, even the operations and administration of the office. And so initially we started with scheduling migrations and moving large matters of content across. And more recently, with some of our applications, we're starting to look at an API layer, which allows us, the content management system, to literally be the back end of the application for document storage. And so the people logging into that application will actually see the content directly through that application and going right into the content management system. This is the level of interactivity that makes this a valued option. Now, for purposes of records management, you can see there's these little toe tags, and I'll talk about those in the next slide. But right now, these are descriptors to basically itemize the kind of record and then also the cutoff date for that particular document or transaction file. So we can start to anticipate when it will be managed as a record. And then it drops into this records management module, and then it knows when to dispose, that's what the X stands for, of the records in each fiscal year. And it'll know whether it's a permanent record, it goes to NARA for accessioning. It's a temporary record, it can get destroyed, but it'll also create a report on what was destroyed. So that'll help us in searching for documents that have been illegally destroyed. And then the third option, which has come out a lot with these migrations, is people wanting to keep things a little bit longer for either business reference purposes or whatever. And we create that with an annual review cycle for those documents to see if they're okay for scheduling for destruction, or, well, just these are all temporary records, these business reference. Next slide, please. Oh, could we go back one slide? I did promise, one of the things that I am involved in is the ISO International Standards Organization, and they're in the process of developing a standard for trustworthy storage solutions. And one of the things that we've had a lot of discussions about is identifying what are the triggers for items that go into the content management system and are how they become either eligible for records management or storage, destruction, or migration out, to prevent any kind of malicious-ware, malware. It also includes legal holds or any conditions. And this has been very instructive for me to understand as we designed this records management module, how we can anticipate those standards. That is a standard that we hope to have published in the next year at ISO. But ISO works at even a slower pace than NARA time, so I'm never quite sure when that's reviewed. But it seems to be going through fairly quickly. It's a good standard to insist upon if you're looking for a good content management system. Right now, the usual standard is DoD 5015.2, and that's a very large standard for content management systems and records management in particular. I think there's other ISO standards for records management, but I think that this newer one is going to talk about the document management, content management in such a way that it'll make it easy to piggyback. The last thing I want to say about the content management or document management is Lisa was talking about the GSA's acquisition system category, where records management offices can purchase either services or products that are associated with electronic record keeping and document management. One of the things that I strongly encourage people to do is to consider aligning yourself with your IT office or legal or whoever else might have a document management system in place, and figure out how you can leverage that current item, current document system in place to attach a records management module. It'll be less expensive than trying to spec out and set up a content management system. There's a lot of compliance issues with saving records for legal research, for FOIAs, for the data calls we get that's over and above records management, but it also helps to bolster our need to set up document management systems that's sympathetic to records management. Next slide, please. I mentioned meta-tagging, and this is a larger slide of those things. You could either have a record as a record of the document itself or a case file. And part of the voyage of updating our record schedule was learning that much of the itemized documents and record types record items we were coming up with could be all lumped together into a case file. A perfect example is a contracting file. Every agency has one of those. And if you treat that as one big case file, it's a lot easier to move electronically. The two toe tags or tags that are there, I call them toe tags because these are dead documents, is a record type. It's the kind of record schedule that is. In this case, it's really small, but that's GRS 1.1010, a contracting file. And the close date is usually when that contract was closed, so we know when the cutoff date is and know when to start counting forward how long to retain that. These are the typical things that these are the basic minimum requirements that I found we needed for every document. So I made sure that these meta tags were on every document that went into the document management system. I had to fight for it, but once people could understand that this ties into the records management module, it started to make sense. The other things that we're starting to find is there are useful other meta tags that we may want to attach, and we're just starting to explore this to set up some standards. We haven't set any standards yet, but we're getting there with our content models. Obvious is a file size, a file format, which I'll talk about in a little bit. A date last modified usually tends to be the cutoff date if you don't have any other information. And a lot of things that are the line of business tags are usually those tags that are associated with the line of business if you're trying to retrieve the document. Things like a contract number, a lease number, we have building numbers, when the transaction date or description of those things, and then line of business search fields of how those lines of business search for those items in particular. They may have certain labels in their applications that they use as a way to search for things. And this takes a lot of consulting with the businesses and back and forth to learn about how each business line organizes its information, how they look for it. And that's the key for really good meta tagging, because if the line of business understands it, it's likely that when we turn these records, permanent records, over to NARA, that these kinds of fields would be useful for the public when they become public documents. Or if they're in a temporary setting, then they would be accessible in the EDMS system during its life cycle. One of the things we do when we delete the documents out of the document management system is we retain all these meta tags. And when the document is removed, we'll put what I call a wooden block or a Washington slept here block that basically says this document was destroyed on X date in accordance with the law, the records law, and this policy. That helps people searching through FOIAs or data calls or any kind of legal search to know that this document was officially either destroyed or forwarded to NARA. There isn't a lot. Lisa was talking about a lot of the electronic document, permanent electronic document meta tag standards. What I used to start with is the Dublin Core standards, which is used across the web. It's a standard that's been created out of Dublin, Ohio, and the NARA guidance also has some guidance on electronic recording that Lisa already referred to. Next slide, please. So next steps for your agency. Update your record schedule over 10 years old to get that media neutrality. and also simplify your workload. Secondly, prioritize those permanent records, because this is a lot of back and forth. It took 7 years for us to kind of update our schedule comprehensively, and that was quite a bit of work. And I think that if agencies start to do that, you're going to simplify your numbers of records you have to manage. Define an allowable and sustainable formats policy. Every agency has a records management directive or issuance from high level office, basically as an internal control mechanism. And defining what sustainable formats or allowable formats is going to help you avoid getting Fred's favorite document management format that is completely obscure to every other system. Sustainable formats are things that are sustainable regardless of what proprietary system it's in. And a good guidance is the NARA's transfer guidance tables that they included you to the site there. It's on their webpage. But if your agency is starting to do this, this will help you when you start to work with your applications and identifying born digital documents that need to be brought across, and any kind of conversion needs you have on those formats. The obvious ones, the Microsoft documents, the PDFs, JPEGs, Move, Inbox is for electronic records, electronic mail. Those kinds of things are all listed extensively of preferred and allowable formats in those tables, under those guidance tables. I think to be easy for yourself as an agency is just reference that as your guidance. And then if it changes, then you don't have to update your directive every time. Let NARA carry that. These are also the guidance formats that are needed for transfer of electronic permanent records, but you should apply them to temporaries as well. There, I said it out loud. Inventory your applications. There's a lot of born digital records and data that's already there in those applications. So I strongly recommend that you consider working those inventories so you can identify them and work with the IT offices to start to schedule those things. That way you don't necessarily need an EDMS, you just need a series of processes. Create a storage and transfer place for your, like the EDMS for both permanent and records. And one of the things that we did here in Fermi Labs GSA is basically leveraging a scanning contract with a government publishing office. They are willing to broker scanning contracts directly. And for those small jobs, they might be able to do it very inexpensively and a lot more quickly than negotiating an entire contract process. I found they were very easy to work with over the last 10 years, and it's something I'm recommending. Okay, I'm going to open it up for questions if there are any.
Yeah, thank you very much. And a whole bunch of questions flowing in. I want to get to as many of them as we can. You just mentioned leveraging GPO's scanning services. One question that came in was whether GSA created one contract for scanning services, or did each office division take their own path and have to pay for those services out of their own operating funds?
Well, that's a great question. We started with some small offices. We had many scanning initiatives going on all over. I did one here in Chicago to scan building drawings, which are very large, oversized drawings, and we ran that contract throughout the Midwest with major cities. And so a very complicated, many-tiered program that made use of small businesses, local small businesses, to do that contracting. That was run centrally out of Region 5 in GSA here in Chicago. We've also did work, and that was with many vendors. We also did one with a single vendor, Rico, that helped us with our office move in Washington, D.C. about 5 years ago. And we now have the capability, since GPO is a very centralized office, we are considering looking into scanning on a national scale for whenever we encounter collections of paper documents that need to be converted. But as we've been doing this for a number of years, our need has started to drop off because much of this is already born digital, and we just keep it digital. We just need to find it and then get to the point where we can say anything you encounter in an office that's paper is just a reference copy, and you can destroy whenever you no longer need it because we know that the electronic's somewhere. I hope I answered your question.
I think so, yeah. And a somewhat related question about, you're saying that you have digitized all those things, and so the paper is just a reference copy. What happens if for a certain program or effort, your agency can't meet the deadline? Lisa talked about exception processes, but how are you on the GSA side preparing for places where December 2022 might not work? And I guess the related question is, how does NARA know if all the documents were digitized and sent?
They don't. I think one of the things that we have done, my boss and I have traveled all over the country to each regional office and have done an inspection of the paper. It took us about 2 years to get to all 11 regions. Many of it is piggybacked on office moves where we've reduced the amount of space, office space, and the storage capabilities of those offices in large part, and then identify the major projects that need to be either digitized or processed as records. They might be duplicates, they just never got around to it. And that's the biggest problem, is we have so much already electronic, and the paper files are going stuffed in closets, and you have to discern whether to keep the paper and use electronic or convert the paper into electronic because they're the only copies available. And so that discernment process takes a lot of time. And to the largest extent possible, I feel pretty confident in saying we're over the hump, maybe not all the way at the far end of that bell curve, but we're over the hump of identifying paper items that need to be scanned.
Mm-hmm.
It's mostly stuff that gets pulled out of smaller closets now that we weren't aware of. The larger closets we've already inventoried and identified and have some kind of scale of magnitude about how much scanning we do need.
Got it. And last question that we have time for, I'm afraid, is about the system that you outlined, and you gave a lot of really useful specifics there, so thank you. But I guess the fundamental question was, who built this? Was this a single project that you worked with a set vendor or group of vendors, or has this been kind of a more sprawling architecture that's evolved over time?
Well, we have a very small office, 4 people, running records management nationwide. So of course we had to leverage the assistance of the even though my business title is it requires a 2-sided card, it's a very small office. But we leveraged a lot of need through the IT, information technology, chief information officer, and basically they had a need for document management to reduce the numbers of documents, that repositories that they were creating, and that we're dealing with a lot of legacy applications. So we kind of piggybacked on that need to reduce the number of applications and data centers in this agency, as well as create an economically feasible model for a web-based solution for storing documents and managing them as such. Too often, IT will set up applications that become ballooning in the amount of stuff they have, and they don't have good guidance on how to keep it lean and mean, how to manage both the data and the documents as records. And so we were able to convince them that this was a valuable service for all and a win-win for everybody.
Great. Thank you. And I once again, we have more questions than we can squeeze in. I hope you're able to stick around, and I know a couple of them that popped up may actually be more appropriate for the next panel, so I'm going to save a couple of them for there. But you've got a lot for people to chew on, and again, those slides have some very specific details. We'll be sure to share those with folks after the event. But thanks for spending the morning with us and sharing GSA's story.
Thank you very much. Appreciate the time.
All right.